Good evening. So it finally happened. I finally decided to look at the Rust programming language. For a long time, I kind of had this mindset that Rust was a toy language and anything worth having was going to get integrated into like C++ or some other more mainstream language. But then I started seeing articles about different companies using Rust. The one that really got me though was when I read an article about Microsoft using Rust, which kind of blew me away because not only is Mozilla a competitor in the sense that they have a competing browser, but Microsoft has their own languages and compilers, but they're looking at Rust, which is something made by somebody else. So that's kind of the piece that made me want to look at Rust and try to figure out why everyone is so excited about it. So I took a look at the Rust manual or part of the Rust manual, sort of leafed through it. Um, got a general idea of how the language works, but I'm kind of a kinesthetic learner, so I decided to make a web application to see how far I could take it with the Rust language. And as it turns out, there's already frameworks available to do this. So there's Rocket, which is sort of like the web server piece to it, but also has a port of Handlebars, which also surprised me. I've used that before with Node.js, so I was already somewhat familiar, and it's very similar to how it works in there. With the main difference obviously being is that the code behind it is going to be Rust rather than JavaScript. But the templating is very similar to the experience I had with Node.js and Handlebars. So pulled up some examples and started pulling together a simple website to test the system out. And that's what I have up on the screen on the left-hand side is I've got VS Code up and I'm running a simple little web application that I created. One of the things I noticed right out of the gate though is the module system actually seems kind of complicated to me. Now, I'm coming from a C Sharp and VB.NET background, so I'm used to add a reference to the project for all the DLLs you want, and you can either use an import statement or you can fully qualify a particular type. And that's kind of what's going on with the use. Use seems pretty close to an import statement, but there's also macros that you have to worry about, which are separate. There's a use macro keyword, and then the other thing is there's this notion of the crate, which is the outermost piece, and then you've also got sort of the wildcards. You can do like an asterisk, but um, so it took me a little bit to get that going, and ended up refactoring a bit because the my first attempt was pretty messy. But that was one of the things that I ran in that could be a little complicated. And then the compiler will try to give you hints about missing elements, like if you call a function or something that isn't in scope, but it finds something that's out of scope, it may give you some suggestions. So that was somewhat helpful, but it still took some work to sort of clean up my example here. Which brings me to the next point. I was talking about the compiler returning in so Rust has cargo, which is kind of like npm in Node.js, and it's actually surprisingly nice. Um, One of the things that I've run into with cross-platform development, for example, is you can run into weird scenarios where you have to do one thing on Windows and then another thing on, say, Linux. And if you're doing like CMake, you may have to put some stuff in there to handle the different scenarios or really any build system that I've worked with for, say, C++. But Cargo seems like the commands are the same whether you're on Windows or Linux. Like it legitimately doesn't care. You just have your directory and you can say cargo build to actually create an executable or cargo run to actually kick the thing off. And it'll actually download all of the dependencies for you, which is also super nice. Now, that's based on this cargo TOML file. You can see here I've got like a bunch of dependencies that I threw in here. So you do have to tell it what your project depends on, and then of course you would import these crates, because that's what they call these packages, into your solution. So you have to do like, let's see if I can find an example here. Yep, so we've got these extern crate, and then whatever it's called. So you can see I've got Rocket contrib, using bcrypt for the password hashing, although I haven't actually implemented that in my solution yet. I'm just using a super secure clear text password link here. Over here you can see it's just admin. I'm going to work on changing that out later. But so that's actually pretty nice. I like that a lot, and that feature alone might get me to spend some more time with this language. Um, that being said, one of the things that actually seems rather annoying to me is the result structure. Um, so most things seem like they return a result, and then you have to basically get the actual value out of there. And they're expecting you to do error handling. You can also do like an unwrap call, but of course you wouldn't typically want to do that because then you're not actually handling that scenario. Um, that seems more burdensome than what I'm used to in, say, like C Sharp, where I can throw an exception, and then at sort of the highest level of the right before sort of the return to the user, so on the user interface, I can catch that exception, and then based on the type of exception and any properties on the exception that are relevant, I can log something to whatever logging framework I'm using, whether it's Traceriders or whatever, and then display something friendly to the user. This seems like this is going to be more work, and I'm not really seeing the benefit of this yet, other than the fact that I am not throwing an exception, which may be the point. I know Stack One can be expensive, but so I'm still kind of on the fence on this whole result business, but we'll have to see. Another thing that I found pretty impressive though is the memory usage. So I'm going to pull up Task Manager here. So we got this little Rusty Dagger, because that's what I'm calling my web application. That's its code name. And we can see that the memory usage is setting at 3 megabytes. Let that sink in for a minute. 3 megabytes. And I'm running a little web application. So it's pulling in all the different pieces that it needs to serve up the web pages. That's extremely tiny, like impressively tiny. So another thing to mention with this 3 megabytes is this is a debug build too. I haven't done a release build yet, but I'm assuming that the usage is going to be smaller when I go to a release build. But that's just crazy to me how small that is. But then again, I guess I'm used to managed languages that have runtimes and things that have to get spun up along with it, and large libraries that get counted as part of the working set. So that's I think that's most of my experience so far. I mean, there's some ups and downs, but it really hasn't been that bad. The only thing that was a little annoying is if you look at my database connection here, this little asterisk right here, I had to dereference this. I had trouble finding this in documentation um, between Rocket and Diesel, because I guess when you're working with Diesel directly, you wouldn't necessarily have to do this, because this is actually grabbing the value out of this application pool, so you're actually sort of pulling it out of Rocket's app pool. So looking back and forth between like the Rocket examples, which were kind of incomplete, and then the Diesel examples, which were doing it a different way, it took me a little bit to figure out that, and I was getting errors about missing trait, which didn't help me at all realize that I just needed an asterisk there, and then that would make everything work. That was with the database specifically. Up to that point, the only other thing was the modules that I mentioned earlier. So all in all, let's say my experience was pretty good. It's not too bad. It is still kind of like the honeymoon period with this language, so we'll see if some of the things like the modules end up being more or less annoying later. All right, I think it's time for sleep. Good night, everyone.